Sorry, guys. Hi. Okay. I'm learning how to use this software. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about the article that we've been reading, The Question of Cultural Appropriation, because I feel like we talked about it a little bit gosh, that was Tuesday, but we didn't really talk about it in much detail. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes. This unit, over the course of Unit 2, we've been analyzing how different authors approach the definition of cultural appropriation, right? So Kapadia discussed it using the concept of food. Joseph explored the concept in terms of representation in the media and in the film Moana. And in this article, Gray really took a wider-ranging approach in the question of cultural appropriation. If we examine her text, I think we'll find that she really tries to decipher whether or not the term cultural appropriation is useful when it's describing the damage that's done in the different kinds of examples that she uses, right? So I'm actually looking at the text on the Current Affairs website. And so I've shared the link in our discussion board so you can look at that, right? And she starts her article in a really interesting way. She starts it by talking about a pretty compelling example, which is Elvis and his song Hound Dog, right? And then only after she uses that example does she go on to describe the kind of difficulty that people have understanding the term cultural appropriation, because there used to be a time maybe where people thought it was clear, right, what it meant if something was being culturally appropriated. So here she says, what constituted cultural appropriation might once have been relatively clear. If you wore a ceremonial Native American headdress without actually being a Native American performing a ceremony, you were disrespectfully appropriating culture that was not your own. And then shortly thereafter, she really explains to us why she's writing this article, right? And I think the reason why is similar to the reason why Kapadia is writing the article, which is a reaction to how people are very quick to assign the label of cultural appropriation to a thing, right? So if we're putting this text in conversation with just Kapadia's text, I think that there are some similarities, because here when she says, nowadays the notion can be far more expansive in scope, right? I think that's similar to what Jess Kapadia was saying when she was saying, is it really cultural appropriation if two white women open a burrito food truck, right? Gray writes, the more things are stuffed under the cultural appropriation tent, the more legitimate the concern that it may put limits on creativity, cultural exchange, and innovation. And she goes on to share a lot of examples of that, right? So one is this white artist who displayed a painting of Emmett Till's body. And Emmett Till, if you don't know, is the young African-American who was brutally murdered in the U.S., young man who was brutally murdered. And so that question of, well, can a white painting encapture or encapsulate that person's image, because she's not from that culture, white painter. So another example is when Chris Cleave, who's a British author, a white novelist, uses a Nigerian schoolgirl as the protagonist of his book Little Bee, right? And so she's trying to really grapple with whether or not that example and those examples actually are cultural appropriation or not. And so she's really struggling to come up with a definition, right? She argues these examples do represent an artist or a creative person expanding outside of their cultural worlds to represent something that does not look like them, right? And so that's very similar to what Kapadia is talking about when those white people sell burritos, or to what Ali Joseph is talking about when people from Disney, represent Pacific Islanders and aren't the ones responsible for creating the text. And so this author wants to find a way to understand and know whether or not something is or is not cultural appropriation based on the circumstances, right? And so I would just kind of encourage you to compare her exploration of that question with how Kapadia and how Joseph explore that question, but because they both do. But I think they use different appeals and different kind of rhetorical techniques to get to their answer. And they also, I think, come up with different conclusions, right? So again, we're putting these texts into conversation. It seems like Ali Joseph, the author of the Moana article, is presenting an argument primarily rooted in ethos. So how do Indigenous people respond to representation in Moana? That's an appeal to ethos, right? Because she's using the credibility of those people to really determine whether or not the Moana is an example of cultural appropriation. Whereas Capadia uses examples, and then sometimes her tone is sarcastic or ironic, right? And so I think almost that's like an appeal to pathos, an appeal to emotion, because she's trying to get the reader on her side, it seems like, almost. Yeah, and so I think, how is Joseph approaching this? I mean, how is Gray approaching this argument or this question in the article about the question of cultural appropriation? Is she appealing to emotion? Do you find that she appeals to pathos at all? Does she use people who are representing the voices that might be culturally appropriated? You know, does she interview Big Mama Thornton? Does she interview the family of Emmett Till or other African-American activists to determine whether or not they think it's appropriate for a white person to paint an image of a young African-American? I don't think so. I don't think that's how Gray approaches the topic, the question. I think she does it in a much different way. And so it's really useful to compare how those three authors are making those articles, right? And what the turn that Gray takes is also really interesting, because she kind of dismantles the idea of cultural appropriation and kind of starts to say that it's actually not even that useful of a term, right? So if we compare the three articles, Capadia doesn't really define cultural appropriation in her article. It's kind of this, you know it when you see it thing. And then Gray in the Moana article, in the question of cultural appropriation article, really does set out to seek a clear definition, right? So comparing to Capadia, she really does want to seek a clear definition. And so we can go back to her text. Sorry, I'm looking for it on my... so if we go back to her text, and I can pull it up. So down here, right, she says, if the definition of appropriation had stayed narrow, it would be easy enough to defend, right? So that definition, that includes, using the Native American headdress as a costume. That makes it really kind of easy to defend, because that's a clear-cut example of something that has symbolic meaning to a cultural group, right? But it gets a little murkier when we're talking about the burritos in Portland. So let's look at her text. If the definition of appropriation had stayed narrow, it would be easy enough to defend. It's obvious why it's insulting and upsetting for a white person to casually sport a feathered headdress. They are items of deep symbolic meaning to the people who originated them, bestowed in recognition of great achievements. Treating them like party hats cheapens and dishonors them and slights those people who have the same feelings about their tribal regalia that military members have about the sanctity of medals and uniforms, right? If don't culturally appropriate just means don't treat things that are sacred to other people with ignorance and mockery, critics of the concept could be easily dismissed. The demand to be permitted to appropriate would simply be the demand to be able to act like a jackass without social consequence. And if there's one thing jackasses inarguably deserve, it's social consequences, right? But Gray really points out something that goes hand in hand with the reason that this class is called critical reading and writing, which is that not everyone can just see this is a good example of cultural appropriation and this is a bad one, right? We can't always agree or see clearly when something is or isn't offensive or isn't wrong, right? She writes, as the appropriation concept has been used to object to many formally innocuous forms of cultural mixing, certain criticisms of the term become increasingly credible. So basically, I think what she's getting at is that people use the term cultural appropriation to just dismiss all manner of things, right? So to dismiss the production of those burritos, or even to dismiss Mardi Gras Indians in New Orleans. And so it's only that after she gives us reasons to question the usefulness of the term cultural appropriation, does she then go on to really put forth her argument in the article. And her ultimate argument in the article is kind of a redefinition of the term cultural appropriation, and to look at it not as cultural appropriation, but as something else, right? So economic exploitation and cultural disrespect, which is essentially how she wants to redefine the concept of cultural appropriation. So of the 3 articles that we've read so far, I really do think that the Gray article, this question of cultural appropriation article, is the one that uses the strongest appeals, the most convincing appeals, for me at least, because I really do think she's appealing to logos pretty thoroughly throughout, and not relying on ethos or pathos to make her argument, and really kind of showing strong evidence as to why cultural appropriation is no longer a useful term, and that instead we should look at these acts through a lens of cultural disrespect or economic exploitation. And so as you respond to our discussion questions, I want you to think about a few things. One is that we had compared the Toulmin method of argumentation, which is a little bit more confrontational, with the Rogerian method of argumentation, which is more invitational, right? More kind of consensus building. And I think we looked at Capadia, we looked at Joseph, to see how they presented their arguments, which ones were confrontational, which ones were more invitational and open. And so I just push you to consider, how does Gray frame her argument? You know, does she use invitational methods from the Carl Rogers method of argumentation? Does she use any of the Toulmin methods of argumentation? And if so, how? Right? I think she uses both. Hint, hint, if you made it this far in the video, I think she uses both. But why might that make her argument stronger? And then also, you know, compare how these authors actually use the definition in their articles about cultural appropriation. So one of the ways to make a strong argument might be to define the terms that you're going to use so that your reader knows where you're coming from as they start to read. This might be one of the ways that you qualify your argument, right? So that Toulmin method of qualifying your argument, so that you make the scope smaller so that the reader doesn't get distracted by thinking about other things that don't fit into the scope of what you're talking about, right? And by defining exactly what it is that you're talking about, you can really help the reader to focus in on the argument that you're making, right? And so I think that some of our authors are using the definitions of terms in their argument as really a fundamental part of their argument, whereas others aren't. And so I push you to consider how that might be taking place as well. And then, because this unit is an agree-disagree unit, and I wanted you guys to practice making your own arguments, I hope that over the course of the last week and a half or 2 weeks, you've been thinking about, well, what does cultural appropriation mean, right? And I think our authors are getting at different definitions. And so start thinking about, what is your definition of cultural appropriation? Which author do you more closely align with, and why? Because that'll really be the foundation of what you'll do for some of these homework assignments coming forward. Okay. I hope that wasn't too terrible for our first shot at an online lecture, and it's a lot easier to give this to you guys in person. So let's try this out. I'll post it and then respond to the questions, and I'll see you on the discussion boards. Bye, guys.